Okay, we're recording and anytime.
Welcome to the Claypool, and I serve as the co-chairperson of the Missions Response Team for Crescent Hill Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky. Since this evening service is focused on storytelling, I'd like to tell you one. In the image of the master storyteller Christ, this one has several unlikely characters and unexpected surprises that God revealed over time. The name of this story is Planting Seeds. Chapter 1. Once upon a time, there was a man named Adoniram Judson. He lived over 200 years ago. After college, he became a Christ believer and felt compelled to become a missionary to those who had never heard of Jesus Christ. Judson, a linguist, already knew Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, but when he and his wife Anne settled in Burma, it took 3 years just to learn the language. 10 years after his arrival, he translated the New Testament into Burmese. Over a span of 12 years, a small community of 18 Burmans decided to follow the teachings of Christ. One of those Christians handed over an uncontrollable servant to Judson. Kothebue, who had been a notorious thief and murderer, knew little Burmese language because he was ethnically Karen. Judson educated him, gave him his freedom, and he became the first Karen Christian and a great evangelist among his people. For almost 40 years, Judson shared the love of Christ to the people of Burma, planting seeds of God's universal truths. From 1850 to 2000, 150 years, Christianity grew from people group to people group, from generation to generation in Burma. Chapter 2. In 1998, Crescent Hill Baptist Church joined the CBF's Adopt a People program, choosing the Palong people in Thailand. They were an ethnic group of Burma that had to flee persecution by Burma's military government. When 2 Crescent Hill leaders visited Thailand in the year 2000 to learn more about the Palong, they also had a chance to learn about the Karen people. They learned about the Karen students that were native to the remote hills of Thailand, living in the youth hostel that was adjacent to the Thailand Karen Baptist Convention office, as well as Karen refugees from Burma who, like the Palong, had to flee Burma because of persecution and civil war. In 2001, Crescent Hill sent a group of 10 to paint the Karen youth hostel and build relationships, and a Louisville married couple, Steve Clark and Annette Ellard, were part of that team. Over that week, they made lifelong friends. They returned with other teams in 2002 and 2004, staying weeks longer to visit in Karen villages. In 2006, they made the major decision to devote their lives to full-time mission service and were appointed by CBF as field personnel. 6 months later, they discovered that Karen refugees from Burma were actually moving to Louisville. Chapter 3. Steve and Annette put love into action. They arranged for American Baptist missionary to the Karen to come to Louisville to meet with refugee resettlement agencies, Baptist churches, and Karen refugees. He found an interpreter for the refugees in Louisville, and Steve and Annette met her at the airport, arranged her lodging, and brought her with them to Crescent Hill for worship that first Sunday. When a Karen mother asked her where she went to church, she told her about Crescent Hill and how they already knew Karen people. The very next Sunday, March the 4th, 2007, 20 Karen refugees were welcomed at Crescent Hill for the very first time. Our 2 church vans were filled with families. The next Sunday, 28 Karen people came, and by the middle of the summer, over 100 Karen refugees were attending weekly, with nursery and children's classes bursting at the seams. Who could have foreknown, when Adoniram Judson worked for so long in Burma to share the Christ story, that almost 2 centuries later, scores of believers would arrive in the U.S. and that Crescent Hill would become known as the church in Louisville that knew and loved the Karen people, as well as a primary place for refugees from Burma to come for community. Chapter 4. This is not the end of the story. Now, after 13 years, many of the Karen are U.S. citizens, have married, had children, completed college. Their lives are intertwined with ours. We've been featured on the CBS Evening News together and hosted a U.S. Senators Town Hall meeting attended by more than 600 people from Burma. This story is always unfolding, with diverse cultures included in the big tent, open table of the family of God that is becoming a voice for freedom and justice for the persecuted people of Burma. I'm so pleased to introduce you to the main characters of this story who nurtured those original seeds from Adoniram Judson to continue this story in their own words: Annette Ellard and Steve Clark.